It's 12 o'clock and we shall begin today's webinar session. And our webinar for today will be the development of mentoring structures and networks by Professor Kathy Takayama, whom we had 2 weeks ago. So before we begin today's webinar, I'll just share some announcements. We will be recording today's session, and we will share our recording at our SharePoint site at the link shown on the slide, which is tinyurl.com/CPLP webinar. And if you have any questions during the question and answer period, you can use the raise hand question function, and we will invite you to ask your questions. Likewise, you may also type any comments in the chat or in the question and answer function. We will get to that. Also, we invite you to join our Inspire social media channels. We have various faculty at NTU who share their teaching practices, and we do have updates on various technology tools such as AI and some of the initiatives that are going on at the university share on these socials. We also invite you to use the QR code or the link to share your feedback with us on today's webinar session. Okay, so just to introduce Professor Kathy Takayama. She is the founding executive director at the Center for Professional Development and Inclusive Excellence at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. She has over 20 years of experience leading systematic transformation for capacity building to develop high-impact, inclusive and productive educational environments in higher education. At the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, she leads the development of programs and initiatives in professional development and capacity building for equity and inclusion for the entire university. So thank you, Kathy, for joining our webinar once again. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, JY, and welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I'd like to start by also sharing my condolences with the NTU community, but also honoring Peter Looker, who was also for many years my colleague when we were both at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. So I'm devastated and very sorry for your loss, and I really mourn together with you. So I'd like to dedicate my webinar this afternoon to Peter, because he was a wonderful colleague and a good peer mentor to me during our times together. And so here's to Peter for all of the wisdom that he was so generous with when I had the honor and privilege of working with him. My webinar today is going to be about mentoring structures and networks. Just a word to, I won't be able to see your hand go up if you do have a question. So please feel free to speak up if you would like to ask a question, because I may not necessarily see your hand when it goes up. Okay? Okay, so the goals for today are as follows. I'd like to share with you the multiple facets of mentorship and what I call mentorship taxonomies, different categories of mentorship. The reason why I want to introduce that to you is because it's helpful for us to think about the particular frameworks so that we can think about what we can provide as mentors, but also if we're peer mentors of one another, or we are being mentored, then we can really be intentional about particular needs that we might be seeking and what those different possible frameworks might be. I will share some resources and strategies for different mentoring needs and situations. And then we'll think about how do we cultivate agency for our mentees. So mentorship, really, a meaningful mentorship relationship should also allow our mentees to become empowered and thrive and be proactive in determining what they need all along their entire career trajectory. And then we'll look at the different kinds of components of adaptive mentoring structures. So the reason why I like to think about mentoring as a constellation is because really, if you look at the sky and the stars, then they're never going to be static, right? Depending on what time of night it is or how the Earth is revolving, what time of season. Some stars might be brighter than others at certain points. And so mentoring is like that because at certain points, our needs change. And sometimes some mentors or some types of mentorship might be more relevant than others, but we know that they're always going to be there. And it's just, we can be selective and intentional about knowing what kind of mentorship is particularly applicable to a particular time in our careers or trajectories. Oops. So there's some things that I pose for you for consideration, in that when we're thinking about mentorship, then we really need to recognize that the experiences, the styles of communication, and the motivations of the mentees in relation to those assumptions and experiences and communication styles of mentors is in a dynamic, and it's never going to be static. So the one size fits all, of course, doesn't work. And our own experiences as mentors or mentees change and evolve in relation to the relationships that we're having with different kinds of mentors or mentees. The other note that I'll put out there for you is that well-being is rarely built into mentoring frameworks. We prioritize very practical, career-oriented goals and activities. And it's just assumed that well-being is just taken care of somehow. But it makes a huge difference if we can intentionally think about well-being as, again, another strategic factor in that mentorship relationship. Not that the mentor has to be responsible for someone's well-being, but we can really think about what does it mean for the construct of well-being to be important both for mentee and the mentor. And then I want to move us from an institutional structured centered mentoring framework to a mentee-centered framework. So let's talk about conceptualizations of mentorship. These are different frameworks for mentorship. The one that most of us are probably most be familiar with is the dyad, where you have the relationship between the mentor and the mentee. Sometimes we might have triads where you could have two mentees with one mentor, or there might be a couple of mentors providing different kinds of roles, having different roles in relation to a mentee. So those two are probably the least effective in terms of impact of mentorship. And a lot of data show that. When we move on to things like the collective or the group mentoring, then that becomes more dynamic because we'll have several mentees and then we might have more than one mentor. And there are different kinds of needs that are being met and interactions that are happening. You'll notice now that there are also arrows across between the mentees as well as between the mentors and then amongst the whole group. So there, that dynamic allows people's needs, different strengths and interactions to come forth, but it's very powerful to be intentionally thinking about what these peer mentorship relationships could be looking like between the mentees themselves. Finally, in a network, that becomes really powerful because now we've centered the mentee in the middle of that framework. And the mentee is now intentional and empowered in relation to the different kinds of needs that they'll recognize, the ways in which they think about resources as well as mentors as individuals. But they're also now accessing mentor nodes. And what mentor nodes are in this case are those points of connections, perhaps amongst other mentors, so that node allows them to reach beyond their immediate circle. Or that mentor node could also provide access to resources, professional networks, or even other mentees. So you can see that this is quite a powerful network structure because the mentee has a lot of different opportunities and agencies through which they can build what they need at particular points in their trajectory, and they can be very strategic and intentional about it. It allows the mentor also to recognize that they actually are not going to have the solution to everything. It's impossible for any one individual mentor to provide all of the needs of particular mentees, but they also can be aware of these different mentor nodes and resource nodes so that they also feel empowered to recognize their particular strengths and areas that they're very, very good at, but also be able to connect their mentee to other resources and mentors should that need to be the case. So when I talk about mentoring constellations, what I'm referring to is a diverse set of mentors that are in an interconnected constellation. And this constellation will positively impact both the mentors and the mentees' experiences, particularly, I mean, when the test really comes is when there are unexpected major challenges. And the pandemic was a classic case of something that just hit us. And the data, the research showed that those constructs where there was a very healthy interconnected constellation of mentees and mentors fared much better during that whole crisis than those that did not have that kind of a structure. Because we know that skilled mentoring requires a very dynamic and individualized balance of a number of different practices, instrumental as well as psychosocial, and then reciprocal mentoring practices. And all of this is being taken into account the unique aspects of the different identities of mentees and the experiences that they bring. So it turns out in research that those constellations that were collaborative, they were interconnected, and in many cases, they were globally oriented. Those kinds of constructs supported the mentees' personal, academic, and professional development. And it really was effective when mentors themselves were agile and they were able to adapt to new contexts. So this doesn't happen per chance, it doesn't happen accidentally or serendipitously. When we think about mentoring constellations and mentoring frameworks, we actually should be thinking, again, ahead proactively and strategically about what does agility look like and what forms can it take. So these constellations can break down silos across the university and beyond. And that's really productive both for the mentor as well as for the mentee. And they're also exciting because they can foster interdisciplinarity. They benefit both mentors and mentees. And as I mentioned earlier, what happens in these constellations is they start to center well-being and they start to center the identities of mentees. And the reason why is because we're actually centering them in developing and building that constellation. So they're empowered, they have agency in thinking about their needs, their well-being needs, whether it's academic or personal or health, anything. And it connects to who they really are, what their identities and experiences have been. The other important aspect is that there has been a lot of research, and you can see the research papers on my center's website, which is listed there. But research has shown that peer mentoring is one of the most productive mentoring practices. And these peer mentoring circles result in a long-term impact because they create very strong networks. So even if one might start out as being part of a peer mentoring circle in a particular context in an institution, those relationships and the evolving impacts last way beyond that time at university. And what a peer mentoring circle is that it's comprised of a diverse collection of people with academic or professional and personal experience, expertise, and backgrounds. It's called a peer mentoring circle because there isn't a hierarchy of position or power. These are peers who are in similar levels. It could be a group of students, it could be a group of early career faculty, or a group of staff. So long as the peer structure is maintained, that there is no hierarchy, and these people are in a similar stage in their career. And what that does is it establishes a very strong sense of community. And as I mentioned earlier, these circles continue to support one another in different iterations throughout their careers. So I'm actually still part of an informal peer mentoring circle that started 20 years ago, because we were clustered together as a group of, SOTL scholars. We were very engaged in the scholarship of teaching and learning. We came from all different disciplines. But to this day, we continue to support each other as we've moved on in the various diverse careers of our professional lives. I'd like to emphasize the critical importance of mentoring in the context of relationship-rich environments. So what I mean by that is depicted here in this relationship-rich mentoring map. So you can see on the x-axis, the bottom, from going from less all the way to greater are the different categories of functions of relationships. So there might be relationships that are based on social support or academic support or career support. And so these are, again, it's important to think very strategically and intentionally about what is the function of a particular relationship. And then on the y-axis, going from low to high, are the characteristics of these different kinds of relationships. How much reciprocity and mutuality is there? How much intentionality? What is the duration or the intensity of that relationship? Is there trust building? Is there identity, a common identity amongst that group? So on the bottom left, where this is fairly superficial, and when those relationships have minimal types of functions, minimal types of intensity or reciprocity, then they can still be relationships, but they're more supportive. And, it's nice to have that support, but there isn't going to be a depth or an extensive investment in that relationship. And then as you start to get higher, there might be other more meaningful relationships where there could be someone or interactions that provide you with certain resources or information, or again, different kinds of support at particular needs. But a mentorship relationship should be really high on both scales, because they really are very, very high in the context of providing that interaction in relation to a specific relationship, and that intensity, the intentionality, the reciprocity, all of those characteristics should be very high. So it's really a commitment. It's meaningful, it's relationship rich, and it is distinguished from other kinds of relationships that are, of course, part of our lives. They are helpful and they're important, but they are not necessarily what one would call mentoring. And so once we've thought about what are these constructs, whereby we can be very intentional about understanding what a true mentorship is, then where do we move in relation to thinking about that relationship? So we all know that we have moved beyond teacher-centered to student-centered learning in our universe when it comes to teaching and learning. And so I would posit that where we need to be moving is from mentor or university-centered mentoring to mentee-centered mentoring. Most mentoring that happens in universities are really accommodating a university structure. A new student comes in and maybe they're assigned a mentor, or in graduate universities. My university is a graduate university, so all new grad students are assigned a mentor. So it's assigned. It's not someone that has started to become intentional and strategic about thinking about their needs. And then again, I mean, this mentor that's assigned to them is separate from their research advisor who is overseeing their PhD. And again, when a student is working with a faculty member in the context of a research project or some kind of culminating project, that relationship can be a mentoring relationship, but it has limited facets, right? It's centered on the research relationship, but it's not necessarily going to fulfill all of these other needs of the student. So if we center the student, then, or the mentee, it allows us to think about their intentionality and strategy and figuring out, okay, what do they need for particular purposes? Excuse me. So, excuse me. So then what are the conditions that can foster mentee-centered mentoring? What do we have to have? I would say one of the most important conditions is not to start by thinking about the transaction or the transactional relationship, but to say, okay, what is the environment? What are the environments that we have that cultivate flourishing, that allow flourishing? And so if we're thinking about an environment that allows flourishing, then we're trying to promote an inclusive mentorship relationship. We're affirming the identities and the experiences of both mentor and mentee. We're centering well-being or wellness. We're really intentional and aware of our competencies or our limitations and in intercultural mentorship. And there really should be a transparency of communication. And then also we should be thinking about what are the equitable practices that we engage in. An inclusive culture, a culture for flourishing, really has to mitigate everything on the right. We absolutely need to be aware of biases, being discounting of certain kinds of identities, maybe because they're unfamiliar or we're not even aware about the value. Indifference, and then worse than indifference is actually active bullying or harassment. And harassment comes in different gradations, and power harassment can also be really a devastating experience for a mentee, even if the mentor doesn't even realize that they're doing it. And so really, how are we thinking about the environment within which these relationships are happening? So we can think about really an ecosystem. If we're thinking about mentoring constellations and relationships, then what is the ecosystem within which is this happening? Because we have different microsystems that are at play within the context of an academic framework. And so we know what happens in the university structure, but we can't really try to block out everything else that's happening because both mentor and mentee are navigating the world. So there could be a broader microsystem or microsystems at play that relate to the community or the home, the extended networks that mentors and mentees have beyond the formal relationships that are happening in the university. Many of us who are, faculty or academics or are part of professional development centers, we all have external networks as well that we're accessing. And so some of these are colleagues, some of these might be peer mentors, and our mentees also have external professional networks. And then we have forces that are beyond our control, and I call these environmental stewards. So we're subject as universities to situations that have to do with funding or accountability. And so it's helpful to think about this happening in the dynamic of an ecosystem on a day-to-day basis. They may not all be immediately relevant, but sometimes it's good to step back and think about what is under our control, what is not under our control, but what do we need to make ourselves aware of? I distributed to you ahead of this workshop a communication styles inventory, which I did not expect you to take prior to the workshop, but if you did, it might have told you something that you didn't know, or maybe you already knew it. But I highly recommend taking the inventory because what it does is it allows you to be aware of how you react when you're not necessarily immediately, we know how we react when we have anticipated something, right? Where we've planned for a particular interaction or discussion. But when our true selves come out is when unexpected things happen, or we're under stress, we're multitasking, or things are not going as planned. And that's when you default to the ways in which your knee-jerk reaction is going to be and the ways in which you communicate. And being aware of that allows you to sort of take that extra 2-second pause and think about what is at stake, what is the purpose, the mutual purpose of your interacting with a mentor or mentee, and then how best you can use your strengths in relation to how you want that discussion, that interaction to progress. Or it doesn't necessarily be limited to a mentor-mentee relationship. Extremely useful in meetings and discussions and other kinds of interactions. So highly recommend it. So I'm going to switch a little bit here and step back to think about the ways in which we and our students themselves have navigated the milieu of education, and all the way through from the moment that we started to go to school, and then what we're navigating in our universities. In our global world today, we move around all the time. I have moved several countries over the course of my career, and every single time I'm recalibrating. I'm trying to read body language. I'm trying to read in between the lines. And it's a lesson all over again, every single time. And one of the things that I know for a fact is that, in some countries and cultures, some students have been taught and rewarded throughout their entire education, right, to learn how to debate, to learn how to defend their argument, to critique, to be active, to be participatory in discussion. And I know for sure, growing up where I grew up in the United States, that this was the metric. I always got low marks because I didn't raise my hand in class. I was very active, engaged, my brain, but I just did not raise my hand and speak up because I did not feel comfortable just jumping in there and speaking. So when some students or some universities really are just accustomed to focusing on the visible activity as an indication of engagement, then that can be challenging. And that's very challenging in mentoring relationships as well. Because if this is the interaction, and this is deemed essential to one's advancement and their demonstration of understanding critical thinking, then it doesn't honor and allow what it looks like in different ways of expressing that understanding and deep engagement and critical thinking. And so one of the things that I have become highly keen to, and I try to explain this. I mean, here in Japan, things are very understated, and it's important to read the silence more so than what's being said sometimes. But when I'm back in the U.S., then it's like action, 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 right? And so many people have a bias to action, and organizations incentivize this. And so what does that actually mean? Because it becomes problematic in the relationship of mentorship, because mentorship really should value inclusive listening. So how do we create and honor the intentionality behind inclusive listening, and then trying to let go of expert bias, trying to let go of action bias? How do we explain this to colleagues who may have come from other kinds of systems or cultures, or maybe our students themselves, some of whom are domestic, others who come from other countries? And again, there's always this constant dynamic and calibration going on. So then how do we move from intercultural how do we move to intercultural mentoring through inclusive listening? So how do we move from debate to dialogue? I want to share this with you. It's a flower arrangement. I really, honestly, I know nothing about flower arrangement. My mother did flower arrangement. But one of the things I learned from those that do engage in the art of flower arrangement is that the beauty, the aesthetic, is absolutely cherished in the empty spaces of this arrangement just as much as where there is stuff, where the flowers and the plants are. I love that because there is an intentionality behind the ways in which things are arranged, the heights, to make sure that there's beauty in the empty space. And even though I'm of Japanese heritage, I was born and raised in the US, and I'm used to flower bouquets that are just like, fill the space. It's insane, just completely fill the space with as many flowers as you can. There is no room for space there. And there's something to be cherished for valuing and respecting and really finding the what is in that space, what is the honor and the reflection and the contemplation that happens. So I like to think about dialogue versus debate in that way, because dialogue is collaborative, and dialogue allows two or more sides to work together to come to a common understanding, whereas debate is basically you're oppositional and you're trying to prove the other side wrong. You're trying to prove that your argument prevails. And in the mentoring relationship, what does it mean to try to come toward common understanding, even if you have an expert that's mentoring the mentee? Because in dialogue, we're trying to find common ground. We're not trying to win. And, I said inclusive listening. So we're listening to the other side to find meaning, to find agreement, as opposed to trying to find flaws and counter the arguments that are put forth. And so what that does in the context of mentoring relationships is it enlarges our points of view. And sometimes it could change our point of view. Not always, but that's okay. But at least it enlarges it. And then it affirms the mentor and the mentee's point of view. Even if the mentee is going down the wrong track, at least this discovery is happening together in collaboration. The mentor is not just saying, don't do that, that's wrong. It also reveals assumptions for reevaluation. and it promotes introspection. So it's not this absolute, as in we must find absolute truth and defend it. And we're trying to critique the other person's positions. So it's exciting because in a mentoring relationship, it allows openness to change. And it also is invaluable for the mentor because this way we know that other people's reflections are going to help improve those thoughts. And in a mentoring relationship or in mentoring constellations, we have an opportunity to collectively help improve each other's thoughts through that process of reflection. And it's also really meaningful because great mentoring relationships also look for the strengths instead of the flaws. I know some mentors who will immediately go and look for those weaknesses, right? And try to improve them because they have to fix it. But what could it look like if we started by looking for the strengths first and then start to look at, okay, so let's further bolster those strengths by addressing some of these potential vulnerabilities or weaknesses. And that allows us to celebrate the fact that many people have different pieces to contribute. So that's why the constellation is really helpful because different people have different pieces that they're contributing. And therefore, they make the whole for the mentee in a mentee-centered relationship. So the other handout that I sent out was a career trajectory worksheet, and it had two sides to it. One side has this arrow that goes across, and it's the student career trajectory where you could see the goals. Here it is. So you can see the goals of a student or a mentee, any mentee, as they're navigating the university in this particular situation. And the reason why I like to put the timeline there is because, again, it allows in the constellation for the mentee to think about, okay, this is not a static relationship I'm having with a mentor or a professor or peers, but they're going to have different needs at different points in their trajectory. So again, this is where we move to when we're trying to be mentee-centered and we're trying to empower the mentee to really take some responsibility and agency in saying, what do you suppose particular challenges might be depending upon where you are? And then the important box is the reflections. We're not asking them to say, okay, so what's the answer to those challenges, but to say, what are some of your reflections that are going on in relation to particular challenges that might come up? And it is the mentee's trajectory. It's not a right answer. Everyone is not experiencing the same trajectory because they're all experiencing their own experiences as they progress through their academic career. And of course, this is a work in progress. They're going to revisit this and refine it as they move along their academic career. The other, and then the important aspect about this is we as institutions, if we're focusing on a mentee-centered relationship, and if we're focusing on the mentees in the context of constellation, then we have to be mindful of what kind of a culture and environment are they navigating during that process. And absolutely wanting to be sure about mitigating those situations that are going to really increase the challenges that they face. The reason why I emphasize this is because there was an international study that was conducted a few years ago. And this study, this was collecting large data in the context of scientific careers for women across many, many different countries. It shows that in this particular situation, bias and gender bias against women happens at different points over the course of a woman scientist's career. And it certainly has critical impact at different stages. So starting from undergraduate all the way through to when someone retires, you can see the critical points, the circles at which it is prevalent and really, really affects a person's career. So it is a dynamic, and therefore, when we're thinking about mentoring, we should be aware of the fact that these experiences are these crises or these different kinds of challenges that one faces, in this particular instance, bias, is going to be particularly prominent and impactful and detrimental at different stages, depending upon where they are. That's why the trajectory is also really, really important. So if we think about developing mentoring taxonomies, then really we should be considering what are the varying needs and interests of our students over the course of their trajectory, and then having them or working with them to think about, okay, so what are the taxonomies or the categories of those needs? Because then they could be very intentional in saying, okay, this is the kind or the category of mentorship I need in relation to this particular aspect that I'm looking at, whether it happens to do specifically with coursework or project work or some kind of personal situations, work-life balance, extracurricular interests. So if we can imagine an ecosystem that supports their needs at different points of their trajectory, then we can really give them agency to design a map that's representing parts of that ecosystem that's going to be mentee-centered, not university-centered. And so that's where the flip side of your map comes in, where if we center the mentee, so that's me in the middle, and they think about what do they need? What do they need to thrive? And they have to determine what it is that they need. And basically, in relation to those needs at different points, who's in your network? Write down people or particular resources that could support you in meeting your particular needs, knowing that if they're in a constellation, some things will be more prominent than others, depending upon what stage of their career they are in, or even what point in the trajectory of the academic semester they're in. So it allows them to really be intentional. And again, this is a dynamic. It's never going to be still. So mentoring constellations should really support all of these different components here. They should be really intentional about well-being as part of that framework. They should be thinking about the leadership and the mentorship agency of mentor and mentee. They can focus on research project progress if we're engaged in a research mentoring relationship, but also be focused on the career and professional development. And these 4 circles are critically important when we're thinking about centering the mentee. So in our global society, particularly today's global society, it is really critical to think about what these constellations of mentors are going to look like across and beyond the university, not only for our students, but for ourselves. And because we know that there's so many different networks. We have our own professional networks, we have research networks, but what does a well-being network look like? What does mentorship and leadership capacity building network look like? And again, what are our roles as mentors in experiences with regard to our experiences, our perspectives, our intentional inclusive listening, the ways in which we communicate, and our recognition of our cultural humility. Value systems are critically important in mentoring relationships because at the end of the day, the value system is going to really influence the ways in which we view these relationships, or sometimes bias or prioritize certain things because they are aligned with our values without us even being aware of that. So one of the things that I do sometimes with faculty, but also with students, is to say, okay, so here's a list of values, and circle 5 values that authentically guide your life. If it's not on this list, then write it down. Add your own, and choose 5. And so when you do that, then you realize that, these are the things that really these guide you. These have guided you, and they will continue to guide you. And these are your priorities in relation to what you default to. And basically what we do is we reflect on how we made those choices, getting down to only 5, because it's very difficult. Because when you reduce a long list of values to only 5, then what that's doing is requiring us to focus on what we're willing to let go and what we are not willing to let go of. Because if we center one's values throughout the trajectory and across the mentoring constellation, then it allows us to prioritize, and it allows the mentee to center themselves, not to say, okay, I need to focus on this because I think this is what the university wants, or I think this is what I need to get a job. But center your values, because that's what you're not going to let go at the end of the day. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to give ourselves some time for discussion. Oopsie. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And yes, we open the session to all of you here, and we invite questions from anyone. So I think maybe I can attempt to ask my question to Kathy. I'm just wondering if, I guess most mentoring relationships tend to be very organic. I'm just wondering, would you recommend or suggest, and if so, how an institution might make mentoring a systematic process? And what kind of preparation is necessary for such mentoring relationships to develop?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think first it really depends on the situation. If we're talking about if there, I mean, I am not sure what the system is at NTU, but if students are assigned mentors or advisors, then that's a formal institutional structure. And if it's something that, regularly happens, then you could be intentional in all the ways that I've just articulated. However, if these are organic relationships where a student happens to really, connect with a professor, and they feel like they want to continue that interaction beyond the course itself, then that meant what might end up becoming a mentoring relationship can happen in different ways. If it's the course that instigated the relationship, then that has sort of evolved in relation to the student's interest in that area. And then a mentor can start to become intentional by, again, I mean, I sort of default to this thing because, a student can be made aware of, so what is it about this course that has, made you want to continue to come to my office hours or get advice on further readings or another course or maybe even a research project, and start to engage in a discussion around the students' goals in relation to that interest. Is it that this is really helping them think about where they want to go with their career, or is this something that a particular subject matter they want to learn more about? So I think that discussion, that dialogue that I referred to, that co-construction of inquiry is really important. So I think having those frameworks, like the dialogue, just those different constructs, can be helpful for a mentor to really have their own prompts in how they start to probe that interaction relationship, how they can be intentional in thinking about what they are able to provide, because they're not, there to provide everything. So, does that answer your question in the way to go about something like that? Or is there another situation you were imagining?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm thinking of most situations, but I guess maybe to the second part of my question, like in terms of preparing uh, perhaps faculty for mentoring roles,
Oh, okay.
do you suggest or recommend any kind of approach to initiate that also?
Sure. So I highly recommend having them. I mean, if you have them in a group and or whether individually, that communication styles inventory is really helpful. It's fascinating how many times I've worked with faculty, and these are faculty that are seasoned mentors. They've advised researchers, and then they take the inventory, and it's a revelation to them. I don't know why. And oftentimes they tell me, oh, their partners will tell them, yeah, I knew that about you, but you didn't have that self-awareness. But because it gives them that starting point of their default mode of communicating. And I like the inventory. There are a lot of different inventories out there, but I like this one because it's not about personality or anything like that. It's really about their approach in trying to really communicate what their intention, and without realizing what their intentionality might be. That's a starting point for working with faculty to say, okay, so imagine the different kinds of mentoring relationships you have or you may have, and imagine the particular kinds of roles that you want to be playing. One of the most important aspects of that interaction is communication, not just the ways in which you are going to try to communicate your intentionality, but also the listening. So, how well do you listen? How intentional are you at listening? And then work with them to think about if they think about a mentee-centered relationship, then how are they thinking about it? So I would recommend a collaborative approach to that, because they want them to make meaning out of it, as opposed to just give them a protocol and say, hey, do this, because that's really not going to work, as we all know. So there's a question in the chat, and Max wants to know, what should we do if the mentee and the mentor have been mismatched? And then we have to have an evaluation for mentor and mentee performance or outcome. So that's challenging, because if something has been already assigned and you're not able to kind of reassign people, and you have that, then I think that again, it's the collaborative goal setting, right? It's the meaning making. So let's say you're in a situation where you are stuck with this matching, then, and maybe the mismatch is happening because of, for whatever reason, background, expertise, or a number of different reasons. Then I think it's really critical to engage in a process whereby the mentor and the mentee are going to collaboratively decide, what are we going to accomplish out of this relationship? And what does the mentee need? And what is the mentor aware of? And this part, the mentor doesn't have to tell the student, but if the mentee is able to, again, take agency, they also have to, have some responsibility for trying to identify what they believe they need from this mentor-mentee, what are the areas that they would like, what are their goals, and then the mentor can recognize what they are very comfortable with, areas that they're, this is just not their thing. They're not as good at this. But the mentor can say, okay, I know how I'm going to be able to find you the nodes, the resources, or additional ways in which we can address some of your needs that I maybe don't have the area expert, the content expertise, or for whatever reason. But if the two of them can recognize that there is no deficiency on either part, but it's a collaborative partnership to get those goals for the mentee accomplished, then maybe that's a way in which there can be a movement forward in a mismatched relationship, especially if you're being evaluated. There's another question. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Another question from Rebecca in the chat.
Yep. So does it have to be formalized? No, it could absolutely not be formalized. Some of the most powerful mentoring relationships happen when a mentee sees that, oh my goodness, I just went to ask this person for advice, or I was having a conversation, and that wisdom or that insight seems to be so spot on for me. Then of course, cherish that, let that continue. So mentoring is absolutely not necessarily happening in any kind of formal capacity. So absolutely, let those things thrive as well.
Kathy, to build on I guess the question, some of these ideas, I think this idea of being mentee-centric and peer mentee networks are really quite they resonate very strongly with me, especially I think when you did that comparison with student-centered learning. I'm just trying to, even thinking about the peer, it resonates with me because the peer mentoring networks have probably been the most influential for me in my life, but they've always been informal, right? Mm-hmm. They've almost always been informal. So I'm trying to understand what you're doing at OIST to try to, if not formalize it, at least create incentives for the peer mentees to build these nodes, because I can imagine, just like student-centered learning, right? Some students take a while, and what if a individual just doesn't want to build any nodes, doesn't see the value of it? So I guess, what is the institutional structure, right, to encourage someone to build these peer mentoring nodes, if you will?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Prem. So what my center does is we start, and you're right, if there isn't an initial structure, then it just becomes like a social group or something. But what we do in the beginning we run the peer mentoring circle out of my center over the course of the academic year. And we start by what we have found works over the past 2 years is the beginning of each academic semester, we put out a call for interest, and we have themes for the year. And so this year, our themes were, one theme was women's leadership, another one was inclusive communication, another theme was work-life balance, another theme happened to do with just general interest in diversity, equity, inclusion. And then we put the call out for people to sign up to be part of a peer mentoring circle, and they would be amongst peers. So the faculty were one group, the students were a different group, and they would choose which topics they were interested in. So now they had a common interest that formed their mentoring group. And then we put them in groups of no more than about 6 peers in a circle, 6 to 7, in around that common interest. And then we held an orientation in the beginning so that they could, as a group, get to know each other. They put together, they took the communication styles inventory, but then they also, at the orientation, put together their goals for themselves for that year. What is it that they wanted to explore? what are the ways in what particular areas, and then we just gave them the format. Other than that orientation and then a mid-year check-in and a final celebration, we're not facilitating the circles, and they meet monthly. They do have to commit to meeting monthly, because any less than that, then the circle just falls apart. And they rotate facilitation. So amongst each other, they would have a different person facilitating that group. And that seemed to be the right amount of involvement by the center. And some of the student groups and the staff, there's a peer mentoring staff group, they've continued on beyond the academic year. They just continue to meet over lunch or something, because they just found it so valuable to be part of this group, because it crosses institutional silos as well.
Are there any more questions in the audience?
Hi, I had one quick question. Sorry, I just realized the time. So maybe, I'm sorry. Hi, Kathy. Thank you for the talk. I just, my center has about like 38 or so faculty members, and we have senior faculty members and junior faculty members. And the school helped us set up like a mentoring system with the senior and junior faculty. And I started just recently, like kind of rotating the partnerships every year, just because my logic being like, it's nice to kind of experience. Some people prioritize research over teaching, or teaching and service. And it's nice to get like different personalities mixing. But some people said, oh, but I just started to form this really great relationship, and I don't want to be, I want to keep this person as my mentor, which I get as well. So I'm just wondering if there's, I don't know, benefits or negatives or pluses I'm not thinking through, or what might be the better approach.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, because sometimes it's good to mix it up again. Others, if the relationship is going well. I mean, is it possible to give them the option of switching or not, or does that become difficult to manage?
It's a little complicated, but we're not such a big group that I was thinking maybe this time of saying, if you want to stay with your mentor, just email me individually and let me know, and then we'll work it all out. Because that was what I just switched everything up on my own before, and then some people reached out and said, no, I don't want to change. And I was like, oh, okay. So maybe that is the best way to let people kind of decide what they want.
Yeah. The other, but sometimes it could be a little bit of a sticky situation, because maybe the mentor wants to stay, but the mentee doesn't want to stay. And so another possibility could be, in addition to offering them, the option to switch or not, would be you could actually have the mentoring pairs every once in a while. You could give them the opportunity to come together as a group. So the way we did with our peer mentoring circles, you could say once a semester, the group all comes together and they could just share across. So that cross-fertilizes all the wealth that's happening in these dyad relationships.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Angela. So I think just being cognizant of time, we thank everyone who has joined us. We will formally end today's session, although we will hang around a little to see if anyone has just come up with any other questions. But we hope you enjoyed today's session, and we'd like to hear your feedback. So have a good afternoon, and thank you. And yes, we do have a last webinar session this Friday. So we invite anyone here who's interested to join our webinar session on Friday.
Thank you, everybody.